Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 27th of November. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And before we start, I would like to discuss you the projection that we got from the Institute of Study of War yesterday, or maybe the day before yesterday. This organization made their own projection about the winter campaign, and they told us that starting the next week, or maybe to be more precise, starting on Monday, so less than 24 hours, the movements on the front line will be activated. And the Institute of Study of War says that not just the Ukrainians are going to activate their movements on the front lines, the Russians will do the same. So we are already at the beginning of the final stage, of the final part of the campaign to 2022. Tomorrow we can say that the winter campaign is going to start. The final campaign of this year is going to start. The final phase of this conflict of this year is going to start. And this campaign is going to determine the situation on the front lines for the next year. This campaign will determine the process that we're going to see at the beginning of the next year, and will tell us or show us where the Russians are planning to start developing their offensive operation in February or in March. Because I believe that maybe in February we're not going to see a lot of active movements, because we remember the situation in February of this year. But in March I believe that the Russians will start doing something, if of course we're not going to see some kind of negotiation process between parties. So now let's start from the north. From Kupiansk front line. The same stories. There are very heavy clashes around town Novoselkovskaya. The Russians reported that the Ukrainians tried to accumulate some forces to prepare some power fist to attack the Russian position near this town and to push them back on that side of this railroad. But the Russians spotted those forces and they navigate their artillery and attack these Ukrainian forces near Novoselkovskaya, and the Ukraine lost around 30 soldiers and something around 2 armored vehicles. As you can see, this town, Novoselkovskaya, still remains in the gray zone. The Russians haven't lost during the week, we can say, any single square meter. There are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians are not working with massive armies. They're using small commandos and dergi and scouts groups, like up to 50-30 soldiers on the front lines, trying to stretch their army and not to accumulate, because we will talk about the accumulation of the forces a little bit later. But as I mentioned, that starting this week the Russians have activated their attack against the big accumulation of Ukrainian forces, and we saw this. We can see and we saw these pictures on Artyomovsk and Bakhmut front lines. Furthermore, the Russians reported that, as we discussed yesterday, there are a lot of forces in Kharkiv area, and the Russians are saying that it's a very high chance, it's very highly, that the Ukrainians will try to attack or develop their offensive operation in direction of Svatove during this December. So the towns like Kremenная, Svatove, this line is the main goal for the Ukrainians during the winter campaign. That's according to the Russian sources. If we're talking about Liman, the situation is not very good for both sides. The Ukrainians have losses, the Russians are losing their position, and as you can see, according to this map, they were forced to step back, and we can say that the Ukrainians have already established the fire control over the roads that moves from Kremenная to Chervonopopovka and from Chervonopopovka in direction of Svatove. So this very important road, at least this road used to be very important when the Ukrainians were somewhere on the line of this river, Zherebets, but now they're very close to this road. The Russians reported that another attack were repulsed by the Russians, and Ukraine lost around 50 soldiers and something around 7 armored vehicles. But anyway, we see that Ukrainians are very close to this road, and if the Ukrainians send their reinforcements and their armored vehicles, and who knows if the Russians are able to stop that attack. Also, the Ukrainians were attacking in the direction of Kolymychiha. As we discussed, this is one of the towns that stands in front of Ukrainians between Svatove and Ukrainian forces. There are at least 3 such towns like Kuzyomovka, Krivashevka, Kolymychiha, Nizhurina, and many other, and Patalakhovka. So these towns is the final line, the final defense line before Svatove. Svatove is a very important town, and not just from a strategic perspective. Also, we need to understand that Svatove is the area of LPR. This line that moves along the red line is the border of, let's say, the LPR, and Svatove is the biggest town on the northwest part of LPR, and it's some kind of capital of this region, of this northwest region. It's not very good situation to retreat from this area. Furthermore, if we're talking about the Russians, as you can see, they are not doing any evacuation process from this town. The Russians didn't announce about any I'm talking about civilians, of course. So I believe that they know and they are ready to stand there till the last Russian or something like this. So if the Russians knew that they would be forced to evacuate from this area, believe me, they would start this maybe even weeks ago. But for now, the situation is stable, and the Russians continue repulsing the Ukrainians' attacks. Now we are moving to I believe this week, one of the most famous frontline, Bakhmut. Today we got another confirmation, another icon on the area of towns like Azaryanovka, Kurdyunovka, Zelnopolye. And today the Russian sources reported that they established real and final control over the town by the name of Azaryanovka. They reported that they still they don't control Kurdyumovka and Zelnopolye for 100%. They're attacking this area, maybe doing some kind of clearing operation. Maybe the next week, with the activation on the front line, they will penetrate the Ukrainian defense orders and will take. And I believe that by the middle of this next week, they will do this, or somewhere in the end of this week. The Ukrainians there had a lot of losses. They don't have spirit at all. They are ready to run from this position. The only thing that stops them is that they don't have any way to run or something like this. If we take a look at the Western sources map, and if we update this area, we can say that these days the Russians have established control over something like this. I have included Kurdyumovka, Zelnopolye as the area under Russian control, or in this cloud, because we have received some updates and there are a lot of information about that. And to tell the truth, maybe this town is already under the Russians, but for now we haven't received some video or something like this confirmation. So as you can see, the Russians are moving, as we discussed even months ago, that will be the focal point of the Russians. After taking control over this bridgehead, of course, the Russians will try to develop and will try to take control over Avdiivka, and they will try to attack this area at least from 3 sides. And of course, the Russians will try to attack and to get control over Klishchiivka. Maybe the Russians have already established control over these towns. Who knows? Because right before I started creating this video, the Russian sources reported that the Russians managed to establish control over every single entrance, over every single road that leads to Bakhmut. So according to the Russian sources, the Russians have established control over D square, because this very important square that Ukrainians uses to supply and support Bakhmut, and we understand that it is possible because the Russians during this week got control over the gas station that located on this cross, and if we try to calculate the distance, it's around 4 kilometers. During the previous months there were a lot of video, a lot of information about Russian attempts to take control over Podgorodny. Maybe this town is already under Russian control, I'm not sure about this, but anyway, the Russians, I'll repeat one more time, reports and are saying that they control every single road entrance in direction of Bakhmut. So the north one part can be controlled just from Podgorodny or from this area. If we're talking about Podgorodny, in this case the Russians are able to establish like eye control, drone control over this area, and they can control every single movement along these bridges, like the railroad and M03 road. And if we're talking about the positions a little bit to the southeast from this area, the Russians are able to establish fire control, but in this case they will be a little bit more blind, I can say, than from position in Podgorodny. Anyway, we can say that the Ukrainian losses has been increased on this front line just like during the logistic process. Another important roads are, we can see on the north, N32. This one road that moves from Konstantinovka through Chasov Yar in direction of Bakhmut. Because of the fact that the Russians says that they establish fire control, I believe that situation in Klishchiivka and Avdiivka is not absolute clear. Maybe the Russians have their forces there or commandos there, who knows. But anyway, even if the Russians control the south part of Opytne and this bridgehead, we can say that from this position the Russians do have possibilities to establish some kind of control. They have fire control over this square, believe me, they do, but the question is not about the establishing fire control. The most important thing in this situation is if the Russians have their eyes, or using drones, or using commandos or scouts or spies in this town or something like this, or they have like a real visual contact with this position from their own position on the south or in this area, like trenches. There are soldiers, and those soldiers are able to navigate the Russians' artillery in this area and so on. But anyway, the Russians establish control over this area as well. And there is another road, you can say the final road, that moves from Chasov Yar, this white line, to Bakhmut, and this is one of the most important road because I believe that the Russians do have fire control over this area, but they are blind in this area anyway. The only way how to get information from this area is using drones, I believe, satellites, pictures or something like this. But to get drone there you need time, and I believe it's highly unlikely that during this conflict the Ukrainians find a solution how to shut down drones. So this road the Russians are blind. Yes, maybe if they know some kind of timings of Ukrainian supply and support, they can attack this area using artillery, but I'm not sure that the losses from the Ukrainian side are very high. But anyway, to have 3 roads is better than to have just 1 road, and for now we see that the Ukrainians have just 1 road that they can feel themselves pretty safe, if we can talk about the safety of this town. So, but now let's move back to Klishchiivka and Avdiivka. Now the main clashes is in this area, and if the Russians establish control over this area, we can say that the Russians establish 100% fire control over these roads, and after that we can say about operational encirclement of Bakhmut, and their losses is going to be increased not just in the town itself, on the line of battlefield. Their losses will be increased also during the logistic and supply support process. Furthermore, I would like to discuss with you another important area, and I'm talking about towns like Bela Gora, Alexandra Shultine, and Avdiivka. This area. I'm not sure that the Russians are able to attack this town in front. let's say from Azaryanovka, there is a cross. They will be able to build a bridge and then to attack. Maybe during the winter period they can, but if we're talking about the end of October and the beginning of November, first half, highly unlikely that the Russians would use these fields to attack. These fields are mined, and the mood in this area, so it's not an easy job to do. But today I analyzed the map and I found another interesting area I believe that the Russians will be interested in. And I'm talking about small block on the north of in Donetsk agglomeration. There are few towns like Toretsk, Zalizhne, Pavdionne, Pivnochne, and small block or small village by the name of Druzhba. This one, if we translate this title into English, it calls like friendship block. And as you can see, there is a road that leads to this block, and I believe that the Russians will try to get control. If we take a look at this gray line, according to this map, it says nothing to us, but it's the railroad that connected Gorlovka with the Ukrainians, with the mainland. Let's take a look at the Western Russian sources map. This is Druzhba block, this is small village, and this is the railroad I'm talking about. So the Russians do have a lot of chances to take control over, let's say, this part of this village, and they will have very nice positions to pin down the Ukrainians, every single town, every single building that located on this side of this line. And the Russians will be able to attack this area from the north using the real roads that the Russians' armored vehicles are able to use. They will be able to pin them down. So this very important block, and I believe that the Russians will activate them on this front line as well. And if the Russians take control over Druzhba, let's update this map just to see this as a possible development of the Russians. You see, in this case, we can say that some part of Toretsk agglomeration will be encircled, or at least will be get into operational encirclement, will be get into some kind of back, and of course, this is not very good positions for the Ukrainians. From this perspective, they will be attacked from at least three sides. They will have just one way to support this area, from Toretsk, from New York agglomeration, and so on. So this possible possible development of the Russian offensive operation in direction of these three villages and in direction of Druzhba village, and of course, as you can see, the benefits of this attack. And by the time the Russians started the real storm and the real battle in the town of Bakhmut, we are going to see some kind of small operational progress in Toretsk, New York agglomeration as well. So the Russians were trying to get control over Bakhmut, but for now, at least for now, these days, they have created at least two very nice, from tactical and strategical perspective, two perfect bridgeheads to develop their offensive operation, not just in Bakhmut, it's the first one, but in direction of Toretsk, New York agglomeration as well. So, and of course, we understand that this might lead us, or the Ukrainians, to collapsing of entire front line near Konstantinovka. So there are going to be very heavy clashes, and according to the projection of ISW, we are going to see maybe the next week this front line is going to be the most active from both sides. Furthermore, the Russians are showing almost every single day more and more pictures and videos of the situation of Ukrainian forces in this town. Their situation is very bad, very bad. The Ukrainian sources are saying that there are around 500 soldiers are wounded, and there is no chances, no possibilities to evacuate them. The hospitals in this town, in Bakhmut, Chasovyer, are full of wounded soldiers. Furthermore, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, they attacked the Chasovyer with their rockets, and as a result of that attack, they the losses of the Foreign Legion battalion or brigade is around 100 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the Ukrainians understand that the only way to stop the Russian progress in Solidar, Bakhmut, Belogorovka, Spornaya, there are very heavy clashes around Spornaya, and I believe that maybe the next week the Ukrainians will be forced to step back from this town, and we're going to see the clashes for these fortification trenches around Ivano-Darivka. But anyway, if the Ukrainians want to stop the Russians, they need to move a lot of reserves. But if they're moving a lot of reserves, they are forced to accumulate their forces, let's say in schools, in buildings, and so on. And this gives the Russians a very nice opportunity to attack this area with the rockets. And if you remember, during the previous 3 days, the Russians made 2 reports about that. Today, they are saying that they attacked some building in Chasov Yar. As you can see, there is maybe this is school, as you can see, maybe just a residential area, but anyway, a very big building where the Ukrainians were able to accumulate some forces, and as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians 100 soldiers. But the day before yesterday, we got update about the attack on the base between Slaviansk and Seversk, and another 100 soldiers were killed as a result of the attack. So as you can see, the Russians activated because the Ukrainians started moving their forces, and there are not much places to hide, and the forces need to be always very close to the front line. So for the Ukrainian situations are not very good. Now we are moving to Donetsk. Donetsk, as you can see, this town is under very heavy fire, and if we're talking about Pesky bridgehead, there were no changes during the day. The Russians haven't reported anything, haven't provided any information about the progress in this town. I believe that the Russians during the previous weeks achieved significant success by taking Oputnaya and entered Vodianaya. Now they need to have some rest, they need to make some rotation process, they need to fulfill their ammo and so on. And maybe the next week they will activate it here as well. For now, they need to complete their mission with Pervomaiska. There are very heavy clashes, and to get new Voiska in this area. But as you can see, we haven't seen any icons on this area maybe since the beginning of the previous week. So that means that 1 week passed of their rotation process, the time when they're taking rest. So sooner or later they will be activated, and at least they will activate it 1 week earlier or less, 1 week less than we started, if they were talking about 2 weeks ago. If we are talking about Vuhledar, the same stories. The Ukrainians are attacking the Russians near Pavlovka, near Vremivka, near Novomikhailivka. All those attacks were repulsed by the Russians, and without any progress for the Russians. And as a result of entire clashes from South Donetsk to Donetsk, from all this area, and if I'm talking about Donetsk, I'm talking about this area as well. Bakhmut is considered by the Russians as Donetsk frontline. The losses of Ukrainians, it was something around 130 soldiers and something around 19 armored vehicles. And today we got another very important update. Very important update. To understand this update, first we need to open the disposition map and the Russian sources map. As you can see, during the day, there was few updates about rocket attack from the Russian side in the town by the name of Kryvyi Rog, this one, and Zaporozhye. If we're talking about Zaporozhye, the Russians reported that they destroyed some warehouses with some kind of shells, some ammo, and so on. But if we're talking about Kryvyi Rog, about this town, if you take a look, get closer to this icon, you see that this is the railroad station, and the Russians attacked the railroad infrastructure of Kryvyi Rog. And some authorities from this town reported that as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to destroy the railroad facilities of this town. And the thing is that they also report that it will take a lot of time, a lot of days, maybe weeks, when the Ukrainians will be able to restore this railroad station, and will be able to restore, let's say, a railroad connection in this area. Now let's take a look at the Western sources map, and as you can see, Kryvyi Rog is the focal point in this area, and the Ukrainians. You may ask that what is so important of this town. There is a railroad that moves on the north, so the Ukrainians will be able to, let's say, to move to the north and not to enter Kryvyi Rog, to continue their redeployment process through Dnipro and so on. But as you remember, during this week we discussed one important topic about the Kherson front line, about the things that there are still a lot of forces Ukrainian that they still haven't completed their redeployment process. We don't know the real reason. Maybe the Ukrainians don't have such possibilities because of Russians' attack against the energy facilities. Maybe the Ukrainians don't know where they need to redeploy their forces because there are a lot of topics we discussed many times, that the Russians may attack from the north in the direction of Kiev. The Russians may move their forces in Donetsk and here. So the Ukrainians don't know where to redeploy their 17th Tank Brigade. They didn't know this. So they're keeping this brigade there, or at least they do this, did this yesterday till today. Maybe they understood that maybe they would be forced to move their brigade to Kiev to stop the penetration attack from the border of Belarus or from the north of Ukraine in direction of Kiev. Maybe they need to redeploy these forces in Zaporozhye to attack the Russian direction of Melitopol, Tokmak. Maybe they need to redeploy these forces in direction of Kharkiv to make army in Kharkiv more powerful and to have significant success in north of LPR and so on. So till today they haven't made any decision about that. But today the Russians report that they destroyed Kryvyi Rog railroad station, and now it's highly unlikely that Ukrainians are able to use Kryvyi Rog as the area for redeployment process. So as you can see, this situation will slow down the Ukrainian redeployment process, and some Russian sources, analytics experts are saying that that attack works exactly to do this, just not to allow the Ukrainians to redeploy their 17th Tank Brigade. This brigade that stuck in Kherson district. They do have some possibilities to redeploy because there are a lot of railroads, maybe to move like to Apostolovo, then to the west in direction of Zaporozhye. But in this case, the Ukrainians will move their tank brigade very close to the Russian position in Avdiivka. I believe that in this case they can use just regular mortars to destroy the Ukrainian tanks. So this road to use is not a very good option for the Ukrainians to redeploy their forces. They can move to Apostolovo, then to the north to Dnipro. So that means that that attack was successful. Now the Russians are going to check how the Ukrainians are planning to move their forces, because before that the Ukrainians were able to move their forces from Snegirivka to Nikolaev, from Nikolaev to Kryvyi Rog, or from Snegirivka to Kryvyi Rog, and after Kryvyi Rog through Dnipro. Now they need to be very close to the front line. So the situation with the 17th Brigade is very bad. This is one thing, and another thing is that the Russians did this exactly at this moment because they understand that they managed to win some time, and now this might be some kind of flag for the Russians to start to activate their movements on the front lines, because they know that it's highly unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to redeploy the 17th Tank Brigade, and now they're able to attack, and the Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians reserve are stuck in the southern Kherson district. And of course, this is very nice time for the Russians. It's a very nice opportunity for the Russians to start regaining or taking back the territories that they lost in Kharkiv, maybe in Sumy, north of Ukraine, anywhere. And I believe that, as the Institute of Study War told us, we are going to see this activation starting Monday, starting tomorrow. And that's it for today. Military Summer Channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your like, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.